The suite of work that spans those two issues has been active since before the 2007 Bali Trade Ministerial on that subject, which we helped organize. And the work that we're covering today benefits from the generous support of the Norwegian Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Swedish Entwined Research Network. As a launching pad for our discussions and to try to put things into context, I want to briefly note some of the common challenges that are facing the trade regime and the climate change regime today. None of this is going to be particularly original, but I think it does help set the discussions today into some sort of meaningful context. The similarities are striking. Both the trade regime and the climate regime are facing particularly difficult challenges in the multilateral negotiations. I don't think I have to describe the WTO's challenges to this audience, but it may come as news to some of you that the climate change regime is facing similar difficulties. There will not, in my opinion, be any sort of legal agreement to replace the Kyoto Protocol coming out of this December's meetings in Durban, which means we face an alarming gap in governance at the short term. And in fact, I don't believe we're any closer to resolving some of the fundamental disagreements, the tensions that we papered over in 2007 when we created two negotiating tracks on climate change, tracks that have yet to coalesce. Both the trade and climate change communities are plagued by our collective failure to communicate the benefits that strong policies might bring. We have not convinced, we have not educated enough people to make a powerful constituency for either community in the political circles of any of our countries. In the trade context, there are too few people who believe or understand the powerful benefits that openness might bring. Lowering trade barriers is seen in the popular imagination as an act of surrender to foreign competitors with no compensating benefits. In the climate context, there are too few people who understand the science or who grasp the urgent need for change to make a case for action, and therefore climate change policies are seen as economically damaging, as a road to loss of competitiveness with few or any direct or immediate benefits. The similarities to the trade regime are obvious. Open trade policy and strong climate policy are seen by policymakers as politically costly roads to follow at any great speed. As well, both the trade and climate change communities are plagued by unresolved tensions between the developed and developing countries, by a lack of agreement on the roles, the respective roles that each should play in appropriate progress. In both cases, the developing countries try to press developed countries on their promises for leadership, promises for technology transfer, for special treatment, for policies that are sensitive to the development concerns born of an overriding desire for poverty alleviation. And in both cases, developed countries argue that they're being asked to take on burdens that are too great in relation to what's being proposed for developing countries. In both cases, there's the new dynamic of the fast-rising, fast-growing developing countries that muddy the picture, which are impossible to accurately cast in either one camp or the other. But we can make too much of the similarities. There's one key difference between the two communities, and it's one of the things that brings us together today. It lies in the nature of unilateral action. When countries open up unilaterally to trade and investment, except perhaps in those cases where that openness is a condition for multilateral lending, they do so because they estimate that the result will be in their own interest. It may, of course, benefit others, but this is not primarily the rationale for openness. In the climate change context, by contrast, unilateral action is much more of an altruistic undertaking. It's seen by many, but not all, as imposing costs, particularly in the short term. But these are accepted as a fair price to pay for what is seen as a good global result. But at the national level, there's not much return to unilateral action unless we expect to see first mover benefits or unless it will induce others to follow suit. But it seems there's agreement that unilateral action is all we're going to see, at least in the short term. So that leaves us with three important drivers making trade, investment, and climate change an interesting set of discussions. First, we have a vacuum at the international level in the climate change negotiations. It's made particularly poignant by the spectacular failure of multilateralism that was Copenhagen. Second, we're locked into a future where the science is telling us with increasing insistence that action is necessary on climate change, and not just any action, but radical action on the scale of an industrial revolution, but with a speed and breadth which we haven't before seen in human history. And third, we have the inability of democratically elected governments to take action that can cause short-term economic costs, given citizenries that are not brought along as a constituency that are suspicious about climate change science and ignorant of the need for change. So these drivers have led us to a place where governments are, for one thing, only willing to take action that they can sell as economically positive. In jurisdiction after jurisdiction, we see governments at various levels compelled to justify climate change action as part of a necessary element to moving to a green economy. Policies like subsidies, feed-in tariffs, support for research and development, export promotion, are sold as creators of jobs and as ways to foster green infant industries that will become future fonts of economic and environmental well-being. This is not, though, new territory. This is industrial policy, and we have a long history of industrial policy, both successful and failed. We also have a complex set of multilaterally agreed rules that govern what we see as appropriate behavior on industrial policy. But the prevalence of the new green industrial policies and the threat of corrosive disputes in the WTO and elsewhere make it urgent for us to revisit the lessons of past experience, to look at the new angles that are presented by climate change as a driver, and to look at the adequacy of the current law on the books on trade and investment. We'll do all that in the first session that will follow shortly. Those drivers also lead us to a place where those countries that do contemplate strong unilateral action are concerned about lost competitiveness and about the ineffectiveness of climate change policies that simply transfer emissions from one jurisdiction to another, or so-called leakage. And so we have proposals for border measures to address competitiveness and leakage. In countries such as the US, these are widely seen as a necessary ingredient for any climate change legislation that eventually comes about. But again, the potential damage to both the trade regime and the climate negotiations make it necessary to try to dig deeper than this simple veneer, to understand the nature of the threats, the specific characteristics of the sectors involved, and the types of policy solutions we might envision to deal with them. And this set of questions we'll examine in the second session today. At the end of the day, of course, we have another potentially important driver, and that is the lack of negotiating progress in the WTO itself. That is, on examining the challenges posed in the first two issue areas, we may well conclude that there's a role for the WTO in making progress. I don't imagine anyone would argue that the WTO alone would be responsible for that sort of progress, but it may be that we can agree the WTO has a role for action in harmony with the efforts taken in other institutional settings. But the ability of the WTO to act is greatly circumscribed by the need to make progress on the Doha round, or perhaps to find some way to make progress outside of the context of the Doha round. So our last panel will think about that challenge, about what kind of progress we might imagine, about how it might take place, given what we will have discussed over the course of the day. These are big issues, and arguably some of the most important issues facing the international community today. It's likely we won't have completely resolved them by the time of our cocktail tonight. So our objectives for today are necessarily more modest. We hope that by raising these issues and hearing from those experts that have been working on them from various angles, from law, economics, political science, and from practical action, we can lay the foundations for progress. And we hope that the discussions in this kind of a forum, a non-politicized, non-negotiating forum, will lead us to a better understanding of the nature of the challenges we face and to a more crystallized view of the kind of policy options we face in trying to address them, those strengths and weaknesses that attach to those options. So I won't stand any further between you and the discussions in the first panel, but once again, welcome and enjoy the day. Yes, I pass it over now to the first panel. I don't think I need to introduce the speakers. Most of you know a lot of them, and they're well described in the materials at the back of the room, the speakers list. This first session is about green industrial policy. Until recently, there was pretty strong consensus that industrial policy did not work, that governments were terrible at picking winners and losers. But we now seem to be coming to a more nuanced understanding of the sorts of policies that work and don't work. This session will ask what the lessons of that practice are. It will ask how they apply from the general experience of industrial policy, specifically to green industrial policy. And then we'll look at the experience of practice, and then at some of the key areas that are relevant from a green industrial policy perspective, subsidies, IPRs, And in some cases, the link to WTO law will be explicit. In other cases, they'll be implied, or they'll simply pose questions. But we should come back to consider some of those broader questions at the end of the day in our last session. So without further keeping you from the real substance of the meeting, I'll pass it over to Richard Newfarmer for our first presentation.